I'm going to talk about the program that many targets are put through. I'm talking about something very specific. Not all targets go through this. But the tools used in this program are used against virtually all targets. So, what is it? It's a program, a highly deceptive multi-year program. I call it deceptive because it often looks like something completely different. It might look like you've deeply offended someone who sent his entire social network after you, but that's not why it is. It might look like you're a victim of an extremely vicious and secret smear campaign, but that's not it either. Maybe you think the police are sending people after you, or maybe you think criminal gangs are harassing you, or maybe you think it's Stasi-like secret police messing with your life. Maybe you've read about COINTELPRO, and that seems kind of like what it is. What I'm talking about looks like these things, it might incorporate elements of some of these things, but it isn't any of these things. It's something that can be disguised as any of these things, but something different, something pretty new. Now, I don't want to downplay the claims of stalking at the hands of several people. Stalking by groups of people is something that happens. You'll hear about this sometimes. A man might take turns with his buddies harassing an ex-girlfriend. That's a thing. It happens. But what I'm talking about is something qualitatively different. It's not stalking. It's something else. What this is, in essence, is a virtually untraceable takedown program. It's very hard to fight, partly because the program looks a lot like mental illness, and partly because you're being harassed in ways that you don't want to disclose to other people. It's made very embarrassing on purpose. There are several possible entry points and several possible outcomes. Since it's highly psychological, how things turn out depend at least partly on the inclinations of the subject. Also, what I'm about to describe doesn't explain everything. There are other secret programs, which people on the receiving end of this program are very likely to be caught up in. And to make things more complicated, once someone gets taken down with this program, he might get enrolled in those other programs, things like weapons testing or medical experiments. If a target has been painted as crazy, the authorities can get away with a lot. And sometimes the program drives people to try to kill the people they perceive to be attacking them. I don't condone this, but I understand what's going through a subject's mind when he acts out this way. The whole process is threatening, it's infuriating, or humiliating, or a combination of the three. So here's the broad outline of the whole program. At some point, you're put under surveillance. You're not told about this part. It could be years before the whole thing becomes obvious. A pretty common entry point is at step 1. In this step, which is optional, you're presented with a credible threat. Someone or some group of people who has a reason to be after you. It has to be credible. This is your own personal false flag operation, which is going to send you on a wild goose chase for years, so you have to believe the threat. The most believable kind of threat is going to involve money or property. That's an obvious motivation, especially if the amount at stake is large. Certain kinds of conflicts, usually involving money or property, can be seen coming years in advance. But it doesn't have to start like that. It could be you get into an online argument. Somehow they find out who you are in real life, or so it seems. Or maybe you snub a person in public, and so on. Your imagination at this stage is your worst enemy. You're inventing explanations in your mind to explain how it all started. Just remember, things aren't what they seem. Another entry point, things can start here, is step 2. It's very disturbing even without an obvious threat. What I'm talking about are a series of psychological operations in which you're made aware that things are going on behind your back which are unfavorable to you. It could be minor stuff, like evidence someone's coming by your place when you're not around. Again, your imagination runs wild. If you entered the program at the previous phase, you're obviously going to connect those happenings to the patsy you were provided with in the first phase. Around this time, you're also going to be made aware you're under surveillance. Someone might casually mention very personal details taken from your private activities just a few hours beforehand. Again, your mind makes the connection. Here's a great example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you go out to the porch one morning when you wake up and see an empty styrofoam coffee cup on the top step. This happens several mornings in a row. Obviously, someone is coming to your house every morning and leaving a cup there. One morning you decide to get up really early and see if you can catch them. You check the porch and there's nothing there. Oh well, so you do some chores, then you head out for the day and your heart stops. There's a styrofoam coffee cup on the roof of your car. That's an example of sensitization. You've been made aware that the coffee cup in this example is significant. Sensitization of some sort is going to happen during this phase, so you're made aware that messages can be sent to you non-verbally with subtle cues in your environment. At this point, you've been made aware of the fact that you're being watched, and someone or some group of people is messing with you. Stuff is happening behind your back. Another thing that can happen behind your back, gaslighting. Objects aren't in their expected places when you look for them. And finally, you're made aware that large numbers of people are interested in keeping tabs on you. Quite a few people. You're getting vehicles that show up wherever you go, or people who show up on foot wherever you go. Step 3. Now a new, very threatening message is sent. Large numbers of people. This is a message that's being conveyed to you. It's only a message, but it's very convincing. Are not only keeping tabs on you, but they're watching you and don't like what they see. This is going to be hammered home with a handful of exceptional episodes, demonstrations of hostility which seem very sincere. Those demonstrations are very manipulative. You're supposed to remember them and file everything you see in the hostility box. So you're going to get commentary on your private actions at this point from lots of people, sometimes in real time. Not necessarily to your face. There might be well-timed car alarms or explosions in the distance, and so on. Step 4. An extreme harassment episode. Okay, this builds on all the previous phases. You've been made aware that lots of people are watching you, they're hostile to you, and they're speaking to you through this secret language. Now things take a terrifying turn. You get an extreme harassment episode involving hundreds of people, sometimes in a single day, in a highly coordinated way. But because you've been prepared to recognize what I would call covert signs of aggression, objects and events you've been sensitized to, unusual amounts of attention from people around you, street theater, nobody else is going to notice it. So this is all very disturbing, but it's invisible to everyone else, maybe even the people participating in it. A key characteristic of an extreme harassment episode is that there's no escape, no matter what you do. You might panic and flee. People will follow you everywhere. They'll be in your face no matter where you go. You might check into a hotel to get away from it all. People will check in next door almost immediately, and your neighbors will harass you all night. Another key characteristic is betrayal. People you trusted, who didn't previously participate, will join in. This is all very memorable. No escape. Everyone's betraying you. You're supposed to internalize that. Step 5. Okay, you've been broken in. You're now your own worst enemy. This might be about a year in. You're jumping at your own shadow. What really helps with this whole thing, this illusion that's being maintained, you might be hiding in your residence and only popping out when absolutely necessary, but someone will show up almost immediately. Someone will leave subtle signs of intrusion even if you dash out just for a few minutes. This is the space invasion phase. Your personal space is being invaded. It directly follows from extreme harassment. You've made changes to your life that should make it much harder for them to get in, but somehow they get in. Depending on your situation, you might get break-ins even when you're asleep. Friends, neighbors, even family members give subtle signs that they're in on it. Maybe a group of men moves in next door or down the street. Space invasion. They're going to extraordinary lengths to get into your face. And much more disturbing stuff, other kinds of space invasions start happening. Customized television programming, electronic harassment, evidence that you're being watched, even in a windowless, dark room. Now, somewhere around here, you're going to conclude you've been uniquely singled out. Nobody in the world is getting this kind of attention. It's totally ridiculous. This is the point where many targets are led over the edge, about 1 to 4 years in. Because you're seeing this activity around you, and it seems to stem from a run-in with the wrong person, or people just seem to take a disliking to you in your neighborhood, and so on. And they're misusing government resources, and they're in your face. What else could it be? Well, I'm going to tell you. There's another step beyond that, in which the meaning of all the previous steps is made evident, but a lot of people going through the program don't see it. I'll be getting to that after I put those steps in context. If you're going through this process and you're still at the point where you're trying to gather license plate numbers, or catch people in the act of breaking in, or trying to find a lock they can't pick, or trying to figure out what group everyone belongs to, or trying to learn how they're communicating, I'm going to break the bad news to you. You've been brainwashed. Brainwashed people don't know they've been brainwashed. There's no explanation I can give you that's going to snap you out of it. It's so real. In fact, explaining things in terms of the familiar might actually help cement your brainwashing. The only way I know of to break brainwashed people out of their brainwashing is to confront them with propositions that can't be considered without questioning perceived reality. When you start questioning the world around you, you're on the road to recovery. The first thing I want to do is point out that this whole thing, what I've described so far, is a lot like a magic trick. There's a couple of ways, actually, in which it resembles a magic trick. First, appearances can be deceiving. An analogy I like to use is the stage trick where a magician saws his assistant in half. Or rather, that's how it appears. You've seen this, right? Well, when you see that kind of magic trick, you don't go running to the authorities to report an attempted murder, do you? Because if you did, you'd be laughed out of the police station. No, you think, oh my, that's so very clever, how did they do that? Maybe when you see a really good magic trick, you'll go running to a friend, someone whose opinion you respect, and ask, how did he do that? Chances are he won't be able to tell you because he's only going off what you're telling him and your senses were deceived. Plus, he's not a professional magician. Now, because you've been exposed to highly deceptive behavior in the context of hostility, you don't see this as entertainment. You're not looking at it as a kind of magic trick. You're assuming that everything is exactly as you perceive it to be, and you're acting on that assumption, which will turn out to be ruinous. Maybe you're running to the authorities to report what you perceive as a fact. I've gotten better at deciphering the magic tricks that are used by our adversaries, but I don't know them all. You might come on to conference calls and ask, how did they do that? Or why are they doing that? There's a chance everyone will say they don't know. They're going off what you're describing to them, and what you're describing is what you've seen with your own eyes, and your eyes have been deceived. To see through a magician's tricks, you have to adopt a particular kind of mindset. That brings me to the second way in which the whole process resembles a magic act. In the steps of the program I've gone through so far, if you've been through those steps, you're probably nodding your head. Oh yes, that's what they did to me too. And that's the trick. In describing those stages, I was focusing on what you were focusing on. This idea that there's an objective reality, which you're watching and reporting on, in which all these things are happening which pertain to you. Your attention has been drawn to these things. I'm encouraging you to look at magic tricks, sleights of hand, with a new eye. When a magician is doing something tricky right in front of your face, there's going to be a distraction. One of his hands will be going through complicated motions, for instance. All that showmanship, all the patter, it's intended to keep you focused on a distraction while the real trick happens elsewhere. You want to look for the real trick and ignore the distraction. Instead of focusing on all the details of your environment, maybe you should pay attention to yourself. How much of this are you doing to yourself? Think about all the stress you've been through. Is the stress causing you to see things around you in a different way? Review the entire program. Instead of focusing on what they've been telling you, that you're guilty of something, or that your actions are hateful or ridiculous, or that lots of people are watching, or that you're in great danger, focus on how you're being manipulated. Look at the messages you're being sent, not individual episodes, but the big picture. Like, let's say you frequently overhear neighbors saying nasty things about you. Rather than focusing on those things, focus on the message. You're being told your neighbor has it in for you. Someone else, the person or organization that's running the whole thing, is sending you that message and messages like it. Those messages are very believable. You wouldn't believe that someone else, a third party, was counterfeiting those messages. It's why the whole brainwashing process is so effective. Once you start paying attention to what kinds of provocative messages are being sent to you, you can start resisting the psychological manipulation. Of course, manipulation is generally only effective when it's disguised as something else. Nobody's going to tell you, I'm going to get you to believe this and that and the other thing, and here's how I'm going to do it. They're just going to set out to make you believe those things. You only figure out that you've been deceived later. One way in which you've been fooled, that should be obvious, is the surveillance. You might have been watched long before you were made aware you were being watched. You were deceived that whole time. Here's something else to think about. You've been deceived about other aspects of your ordeal. Like, for instance, maybe you think you've deeply offended someone, and that's why his friends are all after you. Maybe you really did offend someone, but someone else, the third party who's really responsible for the whole thing and was watching all along, took advantage of this conflict to pin everything on that person. The things you've seen were intended to be seen. This whole process is meant to be seen. You're being manipulated. Maybe you've seen street theater, obvious performances out in public where people are referring to your private activities. And that's very disturbing or even humiliating, because you imagine that everyone else notices the street theater, and so this is like a form of public humiliation. Well, those are obvious performances. You're being told, look at this, we're putting on a show just for you. Pay attention. What if you've seen other performances that you didn't recognize as performances because they didn't tell you they were putting on an act? You might think there are vicious smears or rumors circulating about you based on hints that people drop in your presence. But how does this go on for years without you finding out what the rumors are? Something else is going on. These hints that people are sharing with you are part of the performance, an act, a show. Are you starting to get the picture? If you've seen street theater, you've seen a crack in this synthetic reality they're creating for you. There may have been other theatrical episodes and you didn't recognize them as such at the time. But you remember those episodes, and your views were changed as a result of them. Those episodes, totally staged, assisted with your brainwashing. That's why I keep talking about manipulation and messages that are being sent. The meaning that you assign to the strange occurrences around you. And those occurrences are really happening, don't get me wrong. It's largely in your head. You were sent messages, and you internalize those messages. Those messages help brainwash you. Now, the methods that are used to send those messages, those are disturbing. All those people, they have to be in on it. It's so real. How could it be anything other than what you think it is? In the final step of the program, which some subjects never get to or haven't gotten to yet, and many of them misinterpret, a much simpler explanation manifests. It's an explanation that looks a lot like mental illness, but it's something else. And keep in mind, all the stuff I've been talking about in the previous steps looks like mental illness too. Virtually every tactic corresponds to some symptom of mental illness. There's a region of the brain corresponding to each symptom, which can malfunction and cause those distorted perceptions. But a real mental illness doesn't hop from region to region of the brain the way this program does. Before I explain the final step and what it means, and go on to explain the tools they use to make all this stuff happen, I want to point out that there is no authoritative information on this subject. Any books that are out there are self-published. For instance, one book which is a favorite because it seems to offer vindication blames it all on vigilante gangs hired by corporations. But that book's self-published. The author is allowing you to think he has credentials he doesn't really appear to have, and is completely lacking in any concrete allegations. It's basically just another tall tale, except you have to pay $20 for it. All the books out there on the subject and related matters are based on hearsay and speculation, or even flat-out lies. People believe the lies because they desperately want any kind of vindication. As long as the author seems to have credentials, they'll swallow any story that seems to match what they're going through. Those books are the author's interpretations of this program. Their interpretations. This is my interpretation, which is no less authoritative than theirs.